Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation on wildfire preparedness, strategic investments to balance risks. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment, where we're focused on practical solutions for people and the planet. Specifically, the Woods Institute is Stanford's front porch for delivering comprehensive solutions to compelling environmental problems. We work across disciplines and we work across institutions in order to develop solutions for the compelling environmental problems that the world faces in the 21st century, and none are more important than wildfires, especially in California. California has seen a horrifying increase in damage from recent wildfires, especially in 2017 and 2018, when there were tens of thousands of homes lost, tens of billions of dollars in damages, and dozens of lives lost. In a really horrifying situation where the largest utility in the state is pleaded guilty to 84 counts of manslaughter, and we're facing a fire season that's about to start in the context of a global pandemic that has implications that ramify all the way from how you deal with locating individuals in evacuation centers where disease transmission is an increased risk, to the availability of fire crews, where the traditional source of fire crews, inmates in low security prisons, is depleted severely, all the way to thinking about the financial opportunities that are associated with bringing places that have been impacted by fires in the past back into action. An incredibly complicated, important, and rich topic that it's going to be a pleasure to discuss with a series of distinguished panelists today. Let me transition now to introducing the distinguished people who are joining me today. And we're short one panelist. I'm going to start by introducing her. I'm optimistic she'll be joining us very soon. After finishing her bachelor's degree from Northland College in outdoor education, Kelly Martin began her career in federal service with a position at Grand Canyon National Park, where she worked in fire and aviation management. From 1990 through 2006, Kelly worked across a number of national forests in 6 different states: Wisconsin, Arizona, Idaho, Utah, Nevada, and California. In 2006, she moved to Yosemite National Park, and last year she retired from Yosemite as the chief of fire and aviation management. In addition to a distinguished career as firefighter, Kelly also has been a leader in fighting sexual harassment and discrimination in the wildland firefighter community. She's testified before Congress. She's been a leader in encouraging and training women to pursue careers in firefighters. And she was recently honored as the 3rd recipient of the Women Who Dared Gratitude Award. Second, Rebecca Miller is a PhD candidate in the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources at Stanford. She researches historic and current wildfire policies in California and their potential impacts on future wildfires in the state. Rebecca's dissertation explores the challenges and opportunities for policies related to prescribed burns and wildfire-resistant construction standards that may protect lives and property. Our current research focuses on how communities in different levels of government prepare for, respond to, and recover from wildfires in California. Rebecca earned a master's in public administration, environmental science, and policy from Columbia and a BA in history from Yale. My favorite factoid about Rebecca is that in addition to her PhD, she's pursuing a PhD minor in civil and environmental engineering. Third panelist is Michael Worrell, who's the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, where he focuses on facts-based, bipartisan, technical, and legal assistance to policymakers engaged in the development of novel climate and energy law and regulation. He also facilitates the connection of Stanford faculty with cutting-edge policy debates on climate and energy, leveraging Stanford's energy and climate expertise to craft real-world solutions to these challenges. Michael's legal and policy scholarship focuses on carbon pricing, energy innovation, and regulated industries. He collaborates with economists, engineers, and scientists in research on the design and evaluation of technical and regulatory solutions to climate and energy challenges. He's an expert on international environmental law with a particular focus on ozone and climate treaty regimes. Prior to joining Woods, Warr was associate professor at Stanford Law School and an associate at Holland and Knight's government practice. He received a JD from Stanford Law School and a PhD in ocean sciences from UC Santa Cruz. And our final panelist is Dr. Mary Prune. She initially started her career as a neurophysiologist after completing her PhD in psychobiology from Northwestern. Mary was in the middle of her family medicine residency in St. Louis when her first daughter was born, soon diagnosed with food allergies. And within a few years, her second daughter was also diagnosed with food allergies. This family medical history led Mary to allergy studies, where she has built a truly path-breaking program at Stanford. Mary is interested in basic research and understanding the factors that are responsible for increasing rates of allergy and asthma. Her recent research focuses on the impacts of air pollution on asthmatic children in Fresno, which is one of the most polluted cities in the region. And Mary's looked at impacts of pollution from many sources, especially pollution from wildfire, where there's strong evidence that wildfire smoke actually alters genes. In Fresno, Mary is advancing the use of technology to improve asthma education and management for underserved minority children. So thanks to everyone for joining today. Let me start out with a question for Michael. Michael, can you help us understand the landscape of wildfire risk in California in 2020? How does this year compare to past years? And what are the special things that we should be doing and that we are doing?
Already we're seeing a relatively active fire year. We haven't had any large fires in California so far, but we're seeing a significant number of starts. And there are reasons to think, to sort of expect that at this point in the season. Most notably, the relatively limited precipitation and snowpack the state received over the wet season. So things are drying out, and they're drying out faster because we have less water to keep things damp and less flammable. I think the other aspect of what's notable this year is, of course, the coronavirus, and that's had a number of impacts on the strategy for fire suppression in the state, an emphasis on putting fires out as quickly as possible and not allowing them to grow large, even when in other years we might want to allow that to occur under certain circumstances to sort of restore fire to the landscape. I guess the other big change that we're seeing are changes in the operations of the electric utilities, where over the last few years, as many people in Northern California have experienced, myself included, we've seen power shutoffs. And this year, I think we're likely to see that as well. And hopefully, a movement toward reduced impacts from those shutoffs as the season plays out.
Great, thanks so much. I see that Kelly has joined, and while she's connecting her audio, I'm going to move to Rebecca. Rebecca, at the level of communities, what kind of preparations are you seeing, and what do you see as the biggest holes in the kinds of preparations that are possible, especially given the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks. There's been, I think, some pretty significant challenges associated with the pandemic in terms of a lot of the preparedness that we might normally be seeing at a community level right now. For example, defensible space is considered, and construction is considered to be an essential service, but it might be a little bit more daunting to bring people onto your property or start interacting with other people or contractors if you're not able to clear out some of that defensible space yourself. There also might be ordinances in local communities that might prohibit general aesthetic pleasing yard work, but if it's for defensible space, it's okay. And so there's fears that you might end up getting cited for something that's actually reducing your wildfire risk. And that's something that's really playing out at some of these local communities. The other element of this is the other aspect, the other main aspect of fire preparedness, looking at things like prescribed burns. Because although CAL FIRE and the Bureau of Land Management have continued conducting prescribed burns in places like the US Forest Service on national forests, they've really put a pause on that over 6 weeks earlier during the pandemic, which may or may not have pretty significant implications on wildfire preparedness more broadly in the area. What I have been seeing, though, is what we've seen kind of as a trend throughout the whole country. A lot of Zoom meetings for Firewise groups, a lot of virtual recommendations for protecting your home. And CAL FIRE actually just announced a new program called D-Space, which I took yesterday, where you can go through and do a virtual defensible space check on your house and check off, do you have leaves in your gutters? Do you have deck furniture that's too close to your house? And kind of get an assessment from CAL FIRE without somebody coming to your home.
I have been impressed at the extent to which fire issues have really been discussed a lot this year, and I hope that some of this discussion is increasing preparedness, and I hope our conversation today is contributing to that. Kelly, welcome. Let me ask you, as a firefighter, what are the issues that concern you the most for the 2020 fire season?
You know, I think certainly when we talk about preparedness and early on when COVID was really kind of starting to get up and go, some of the topics or conversations were really around suppressing fires rapidly and aggressively. And I think if you can think about the curve or the arc of fire season and where fires are definitely needed and required on the landscape, you know, how we kind of sort out decision-making in terms of where we're aggressive and where we can allow fire to burn on the landscape where it's desperately needed. That's going to be the big issue, is how do we best deploy resources to those fires that are most threatening to life and property. And I think certainly with COVID, it's increasing the exposure to firefighters because they're coming from all over the nation to be in one area. And that's, I think that's the issue that a lot of us are really struggling with this year.
Mary, let me turn to you with another aspect of this question of which fires to fight and which ones to let burn. I think in the past, we always conceptualized wildfire risk as the immediate risk of injury or death at the fire front. But now we have an increasing appreciation of the health impacts of smoke exposure, even from some great distances. And as a medical professional working on the impacts, how do you think about the relative risks of fires that are occurring in developed areas where people live versus fires in remote areas where the health impact is primarily via the smoke?
Yes, well, there are obviously a lot of studies showing that air pollution in general impacts our health, both short-term and long-term. And there's a lot of studies now showing that wildfire smoke definitely impacts health, whether it's close by or someplace where the smoke is blown. There have been many studies showing that there's an increase in, for example, hospital admissions for asthma when there's even a 10-unit increase in PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke. There's clear evidence that there's an increase in cardiac events such as heart attacks, arrhythmias. There's also increase in strokes for those age 65 and older when someone experiences wildfire smoke. There's an interesting study looking at ambulance pickups and found that even within an hour of experiencing wildfire smoke, there's an increase in calls for respiratory or cardiac events. So I think, you know, We have to be vigilant near wildfire locations, and also, you know, because the smoke can travel for thousands of miles, how we're going to handle the wildfire events.
Let me swing back to Kelly. I think this transition from thinking about wildfires as basically healthy for the forest when they're in remote areas, which from a forest ecology perspective is entirely true, runs up against the issues with the health impacts of the smoke exposure. And in the wildland firefighter community, is that discussion getting some traction, and how are people thinking about changing the priority of tackling remote fires because of the smoke exposure?
A loaded comments, lots of really great potential discussions there. But I think we have to really look back on how we got into this situation that we're in. Certainly climate change plays a big part, you know, of higher, hotter fires, but that's also exacerbated by a lot of fuel buildup because of lack of fire in the natural environment. And so we're really in this kind of crossroads right now of like, how do we best treat the acres that are treatable through the use of wildfire for resource objectives? Also, protection objectives and human health is part of the protection objectives as well. Those, to me, that's the really, you know, moving forward for the next 25 to 50 years. There's just no possible way to mechanically treat or thin or timber harvest or prescribe burn the number of acres that are truly outside its historical range of variability. In some areas, we're seeing that really when a wildfire takes over, there's, I don't want to say irreparable harm, but definitely the functioning system, you know, of that ecosystem is fundamentally changed for a long, long time. So our research and our science really needs to, and this is what's happening, is trying to catch up and say, in these parts throughout the West, and we're really looking at it throughout the United States, that there are areas that the only way that we can treat ecosystems and help bring them back into some sort of semblance of, you know, resiliency is truly looking at using wildfire to meet some of those objectives. So but it's really, really tough because now you're putting firefighters, you know, on the line, but there's a really good potential for collaboration between the fire managers and the land managers and the health officials to say, here's why we believe that this is important, because we can't just keep suppressing fire and get out of this situation that we're in.
Yeah. Rebecca, I know you've been thinking a lot about the history and the prospects for prescribed burns in the future. I wonder if you could just say a little about the trajectory for prescribed burns that we're on and how much of the task could be accomplished with prescribed burns.
So as Kelly kind of described, we're looking at an enormous magnitude of a problem. And in California, there's about 20 million acres, or about 20% of the state, which is about the size of the state of Maryland, that need to be treated in some way. And there are lots of different ways to accomplish that, but really managed wildfire has some of the most promise. What we're looking at for
and by managed wildfire, you mean wildfires that start
naturally
on their own, but where the firefighters are trying to prevent them from being devastating.
Right, and they're kind of trying to keep them in areas that are fairly remote, so you're not going to be dealing with civilization issues, but are still going to allow to have pretty high intensity fires that'll burn through and get back a lot of that ecological benefit. Part of the challenge is that that's only legal right now on federal property, and it's not possible on state property because CAL FIRE has a mandate to put out fires. So that's one major issue. But in terms of the goals that we have towards more fuel treatments, right now, CAL FIRE is looking towards burning or treating 25,000 acres of land this year, with the expectation of doubling that shortly. And the U.S. Forest Service has a goal of treating 250,000 acres, in addition to doubling that by, I believe, 2030. And so we will be looking at these increases over the next couple of years. But again, when you're looking at a 20 million acre deficit, that's still a pretty big gap that we're going to have to be facing and filling at some point.
And so a lot of solution to getting our long-term wildfire risk challenges under control comes from tackling climate change first, but second, figuring out how to allow fire to be a part of the landscape in this managed and semi-managed way. Michael, I know you've thought a lot about the role of utilities and other actors in igniting the fires. Do you feel like the progress that's been made with the public safety power shutdowns and other changes that have been instituted are going to allow that risk to be pushed down enough that some of the other natural processes can be a bigger feature of the way our fire landscape evolves?
Well, I think there are challenges there. Certainly the utilities in California have made substantial progress in collaboration with the Utility Commission, kind of pushing them over the last several years. And they are spending lots of money to make up for kind of decades of, maybe lax vegetation management. Trees falling onto power lines are a primary way that fires get started. And in general, kind of upgrading what had become a sort of relatively old system in need of new investment. So the risk is lower. And how much lower, I'd say we don't really know at this point. And, as you mentioned, one of the main tools for reducing risk has been turning off the power when it is not safe to operate the system. And I think that the challenge with that, particularly in the current moment, is that people are sheltered in place in their homes. It's even more objectionable to them to turn off the power. And I think it remains to be seen how well that goes this year. Last year, the utilities were quite aggressive, I think it's fair to say, in prioritizing safety over reliability. And we'll have to see how that works out. It's certainly the case, though, that there's a lot more system awareness. The wildfire cameras, the weather stations that the utilities have installed really improve their situational awareness so that they can, and certainly the lived experience of the last 3 years tends to push them to act to prioritize safety during these dangerous moments. So I think we are safer than we have been, but we are not safe. And ultimately, part of what we need to do as a state is improve community resilience to wildfire. Just as wildfire needs to be put back or allowed as a process back into the wildlands, we also need to think about how we can modify our communities to make them safer, because ignitions will occur, right? There's no way to eliminate ignition. And so then the question is, what happens after? What happens when a fire gets started? Can we manage it? Can we suppress it? Or is it just out of control?
I do want to swing back to this topic of community preparedness, but before I do, let me ask a question of Mary. That you've heard other panelists advocate for a dramatic increase in what they're calling managed wildfire and the attendant smoke exposure that involves. As the human health expert, how concerning is that to you?
Well, I think that it's when we talk about research studies looking at things like prescribed burn, there's not a lot of research looking at health impacts. There's a few studies looking at how it impacts a firefighter when they're right there doing the prescribed burn. There's no randomized control trials looking at how the smoke from, for example, a prescribed burn impacts a community. We have done a study, it's a retrospective study looking at how children are impacted in Fresno during a prescribed burn versus a wildfire. And we looked at their immune system 90 days after either a prescribed burn or wildfire. And we found that the wildfire caused more damage to the immune system than a prescribed burn. And to me, that makes sense. And I think that even though no one wants more smoke from, letting fires burn where it's safe to do so, or having prescribed burns, in the long run, that will benefit us and our health. given, how dangerous these huge megafires can be to a large number of people.
Kelly, when the wildfire fighting community thinks about managed wildfire, is smoke exposure something that they can fit into their calculations about which fires to let go and which ones not, or is that kind of beyond the realm of the parameters that can be adjusted?
There's a couple of things that I think about when we're thinking about smoke exposures, and certainly, working with California Air Resources Board and local air pollution districts, I think is really important to maintain that communication with them. And part of that is helping people understand like where the fire is going, and also using modeling tools that can help us model both the quantity and quality and transport of smoke. And Michael's right. It's just we can't stop all fires. So we have to best prepare, where those fires are likely to occur, both naturally and human ignition. And human ignition in the wildland-urban interface is extremely dangerous. So I don't want to give people the impression that we wouldn't aggressively suppress fires where human life and communities are threatened. That's a very, very important mandate, for wildland firefighting. But we also know fires can occur up in the higher elevations, and I think if we can really emphasize the importance of the air quality component, we can better prepare our communities and the firefighters for the type of risks that they're going to be exposed to. And I think I know we can make better decisions in terms of where the smoke is going, who's going to be affected, and how to best get that information to the communities during an event.
And Mary, can you comment on the extent to which things like household air filters and Masts make a difference in the risks from wildfire smoke?
Well, they certainly do make a difference. As far as Masts, there's not a lot of studies, proving that it, improves health, but it makes sense because we know that the particles are filtered out, and we know what those particles do to your body when they're inhaled. As far as air purifiers, again, there's been some studies, a few studies looking at wildfires, more studies looking at things like asthma and how air purifiers help. So I think those are two things that are certainly worth thinking about, especially for those who are more at risk as we come into the wildfire season again.
And we are talking about the only masks that make a difference for wildfire smokes are the N95 masks, and not the kind of masks that people are wearing for COVID-19.
Well, surgical masks do filter out some of the particles, but obviously the most effective is the N95. But again, those are, we're trying to reserve those for healthcare workers. There is some literature to show that a surgical mask will filter out not as many particles, but it will help. And then certainly air purifiers and HEPA filters within your own heating and cooling system in your home are helpful. And there's ways to make the boxed fans on your own to serve as an air purifier. So there are things that you can do to minimize how much of that, PM 2.5 is inhaled into your lungs.
Michael, we were just talking about the public safety power shutoffs, and now we're talking about all these electrical appliances you need to use to clean your air.
And that's not good.
And could you comment on where the utilities are in terms of emergency backup power for this kind of application?
Well, the current push has been, and this has really been with assistance from the Utility Commission as well, is to focus on customers that have medical devices in their homes, so that to ensure that those people have backup power in an emergency, and also to focus on public buildings that are important for emergency services, like the fire stations, maybe community centers that might be places where people could go during a backup, during a blackout. In terms of backup power more generally, the approach that's been taken by the utilities, at least this year, is to focus on segmenting the grid into smaller pieces so that when power shutoffs are necessary for safety, only the parts of the grid that really need to be turned off are blacked out. And areas that might be adjacent to those high risk segments can be left on. There's also been some work to deploy temporary diesel generators, which of course generate their own air quality concerns if they're too much of a normal thing. On the part of, that's mostly been on the part of Pacific Gas and Electric. But I think in the long run, the focus is going to be kind of designing the grid, redesigning and reimagining the grid with fire in mind so that it can be operated optimally during these dangerous times.
And in the context of sort of redesigning things, we already started into the concept of making communities more resilient. Rebecca, do you want to talk about sort of where the initiative to do that is coming from? Are we mainly seeing it as kind of bottom-up efforts from within communities, or top-down mandates, or some kind of combination?
It seems like it's coming as some kind of combination. I've seen local ordinances being proposed that are specifically about things like defensible space and greater enforcement of defensible space. But there's also been a really interesting push from the legislature this session that's been focused on defensible space, on home hardening, on providing funding for some of grants to focus particularly on some of the most vulnerable communities or at-risk communities to wildfires, which is really promising. But it's kind of hard to tell how much money these sorts of home hardening projects are actually going to take, and whether that money that's being potentially offered by the state legislature is going to match up with what homeowners actually need. Because some of these projects could be $5,000 or $10,000 or $40,000 for a single home. And when we're thinking about community resilience, it's exactly that. You need to be thinking about the entire neighborhood or the entire community. It's not just about what one homeowner is doing, and it's about what that homeowner's neighbors and their neighbors and their neighbors are doing in order to make sure that there's that nice protection. One of the things that I'm pretty excited to see coming forward is a new bill that was proposed to establish an unfunded mandate for 5 feet of defensible space around a property that would be non-combustible. And a similar bill was proposed earlier this session, but was vetoed by the governor. And it's been reproposed with slightly different language. And it's been amended by the Assembly and the Senate, and we'll kind of see where that goes. But we know that that first 5 feet is incredibly important. And if that kind of bill could get passed, it might really help protect homes throughout California.
Kelly, when you think about going into a community that is surrounded by fire, what are the things that you most want to see in terms of the defensible spaces and home hardening that have been put into place? What are the most important things that we're not paying sufficient attention to?
You know, I do like the idea of home hardening, but I'll take it a step further. Mariposa County health officers, you know, Eric Surgenko and Dave Conway, we have a really good working relationship with them when I worked at Yosemite, and also with California Air Resources Board. So knowing that smoke is inevitable, we really have to, you know, work with those local health districts and also be very transparent when we have these large fires. Most of these large fires will have air resource advisors, you know, on them who can help kind of predict and forecast. But I think the piece that we're missing is how do we best you know, filter the air within the houses? And I'm thinking about like cooling rooms. Maybe we have smoke-free rooms, and then how do homes, what kind of appliances, dare I say, can people buy and purchase to help scrub the particulates out of their home, at least until the major impact, you know, of the smoke dissipates. So I think there's that piece that we can better prepare our communities. Like, how can we continue to work with our local partners in protecting human health? But then the second piece to this is really, we have incredible amount of investments in reducing fuels and removing timber and treating, you know, that wildland-urban interface. And I think about Mariposa, and it's really an intermix. There's really no interface. And so there's a tremendous amount of ownership and responsibility on certainly whatever the local protection district is, if it's CAL FIRE, if it's the county, to remove fuels and to remove the ladder fuels, because once a fire starts in those really highly volatile type of environments, it's really important that a lot of fuels work is maintained over time. So the intermix is it's kind of a tough bird, because we can't really do prescribed burning. It's going to be a lot of mechanical. So there's not one size fits all, but this investment in protecting our communities by doing defensible space and removing fuels is a heavy lift. It costs a lot of money, but it's absolutely, you know, essential that we do that. And then when a wildfire does come into those treatment areas, you have a tremendous return on investment, because now that wildfire is in and amongst that multi-million-dollar treatment area. And that's the things that we also need to be paying attention to, that if communities have done good protection, let's move that wildfire, because the firefighters have a much better opportunity, because it's good ground, it's treated. It's not the untreated that we're sending the firefighters into.
And this treatment is a combination of things that individual landowners, homeowners can do on their small properties, and the community needs to do on the sort of throughout this interface.
Yeah, absolutely. The fire safe councils are super important. I saw something in the chat about homeowner associations. You know, people have a tremendous amount of influence and power. And if people can really recognize that, hey, we're in a place that's really highly vulnerable to a wildfire, that collaboration between homeowner associations and the need to do hazard fuel reduction is extremely important to the protection of life and property.
Let me turn in this protection of life and property discussion to some thoughts on evacuation. And you know, certainly with the campfire, the issue of limited ingress and egress routes was an issue. With COVID-19, there's a question of where do people go if they're evacuated, and I wonder, Michael, if you want to sort of comment on what the evacuation kind of landscape looks like in the current setting, and what steps are being taken in order to facilitate evacuations and make them safe when they do need to occur.
Well, I think, you know, the first step, and this goes to the points that were made earlier about kind of CAL FIRE strategy, the sort of aviation heavy, you know, fire, sort of intolerance of any kind of fire on the landscape this year. You know, priority number one is to avoid the need for large evacuations, because they're going to be much more difficult to deal with. There are steps that are being taken by Cal OES and Red Cross to sort of plan ahead for kind of socially distant evacuation. You know, staging smaller evacuation centers, larger numbers of centers rather than one centralized location. There might be many locations this year, but it's going to be much more challenging. I mean, we just need to be honest about that. And the reality is that the fires that cause the largest evacuations tend to be ones that occur during, you know, late season, very dangerous kind of fuel conditions, and that grow explosively so that you can't really plan ahead very much, right? I mean, if you think about the Camp Fire, the Tubbs Fire, the Woolsey and Thomas fires in Southern California, they were overnight major evacuation problems. And I think that's the big challenge, is preparing for those fires that are going to be very resistant to suppression. And we're in uncharted territory. I mean, we need to be honest about that and frank about that. And it's going to require, you know, really a different approach if we are unlucky and we have fires like that this year.
Mary, what advice would you give the evacuation planners in order to do the best possible job on protecting human health with the whole mix of issues that we're facing in 2020?
Yes, that's a tough one. I mean, we all know about the social distancing and, trying to keep people apart. But I wanted to also comment that it's not just the evacuation that's the problem with COVID. It's when that wildfire occurs and we get that big jump in PM 2.5, that's going to increase people getting COVID on its own just from the air pollution itself. There's a model that predicts just a 1 unit increase in PM 2.5 from a wildfire might increase COVID rates by 10% in an area. So there's concerns on so many levels. There's also the fear of the flu season interacting with COVID and wildfires, because there's been studies that show when a wildfire occurs in the summer, you get an increase in influenza rates in the fall. And so it's not only going to be I think a double play with the COVID and the wildfires, but there's also going to be the influenza. And as far as things that you could do, it would be as much as you can prepare. The healthcare providers that have more at-risk patients, they try to counsel them on what they can do to prepare in their own home for a clean room. They get their medications and inhalers refilled and ready to go. Get as many supplies as they can so that, if they're not going to evacuate, that they can stay in that area in their own home and be somewhat protected from the increase in pollution. But it's a huge issue, and I really don't know if you actually do have to evacuate, how you're going to stop the spread of COVID.
Kelly, how should we think about things that the firefighters can do to maintain their readiness in the context of the risk from COVID and the risk from influenza and the standard issues that firefighters face with smoke exposure? What are the things that we can be doing in order to maintain a firefighter response that's as effective as possible?
There's a lot of different opportunities being put in place this year, and especially with small groups of people, and a lot more attention to, like everybody, washing hands and cleanliness as much as possible. But shoot, we're in a smoky environment and a dirty environment, and it's going to be tough. I think the jury is still out in terms of how our response and our preparedness to wildfires is really affecting the health of our firefighters. I haven't really been paying a lot of attention to any cases that have spread within a small group of firefighters. I gotta believe that that's going to happen, but I haven't really been paying attention to that. So yeah, we're definitely in uncharted territory, and it's a good point. We've got firefighters that are trained to respond to incidents like this, but it's a completely unknown, uncharted territory as to how do we best protect them when they're responding to wildfires. So I think it's a really huge issue that we're just kind of starting to see some of the vibrations from the field and their concern about their own personal safety. But at this point, I think, we're asking our firefighters to do what the public does, and, as best they can maintain social distance, but the construct of what we do just really doesn't allow for that, especially, wearing masks and trying to, fight fire. So it'll be interesting to have the same conversation, a month or two from now, and especially at the end of the fire season. What did we learn? What kind of practices? What are the best practices that we can and should implement for the coming years? Because I don't think this is the end. This could go into next summer too, and then what does next summer look like?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a more complicated setting where we have this. Where climate change is increasing fire risk, where the accumulation of fuels is really making things a lot more difficult, where COVID-19 is really adding a whole new layer of complexity, and where the public utilities and PG&E is just beginning to get a handle on how to manage the ignitions that come from their hardware. Let me start transitioning now to some of the really excellent questions that are coming in through the Q&A, and I want to encourage people who have not yet entered their questions to go ahead and do that. We have about a half hour for discussions. And let me start with a question for Michael that says, how does insurance fit into this conversation? And what can cities do to influence the conversation about the role of insurance and the amount of protection that's available?
I think obviously home insurance is a critical piece of the puzzle, both in terms of sending incentives to communities and homeowners to take appropriate action, but also because people need insurance to have a mortgage. And there's the potential for things to, if we had a few more bad fire seasons, for really things to spiral out of control in terms of insurability and affordability of communities, particularly in the Sierra Nevada region. And so I think the most important thing that really communities need to do, and this goes back to something that Kelly really emphasizes, we need to be thinking at the community level about how to create safety, and then also create the perception of safety for the insurance industry so that they understand when actions have been taken that really substantially reduce risk, and then they can decide to write policies in that area as a result. And that's, it's increasingly hard to get affordable insurance in high risk areas. It's not impossible, but it's hard. There are insurers of last resort, but they are much more expensive than the sort of traditional homeowners policy. And there's no easy way out. We can't force people to write insurance policies. All we can do is create conditions where they want to come and do business. And that's what the state's trying to do in a variety of ways: reinsurrection of fire, fuel management, firewise communities. They're all important pieces of the puzzle. But I would just emphasize that we need to do more. We need to really be thinking about prevention and investments in prevention as a kind of risk management approach that's going to make insurance available and affordable, which we all need, but also will just keep us safer. Ultimately, that's what we should care about too.
And are insurance companies starting to participate in this in a constructive way, where they recognize the value of investments that homeowners are making in defensible space and in fire safe construction in order to make policies more available, or available at all?
Well, insurance is a highly regulated space in general, and especially so in California. And I think the main decision that insurers are making at this point in high risk areas is whether to allow new business at all, write new policies or not. And they have less control, I think, than they would like over pricing. And that's because consumer advocates have made sure that prices don't go through the roof. So the challenge here is we need to make it attractive for insurers or maybe attractive is the wrong word. We need to make it possible, given the risks, for insurers to write policies at the prices that are allowed. And that involves investments in prevention and resilience. There's really just no way around it. Home hardening, defensible space issues, the community buffers that were emphasized earlier in the conversation. And if we don't do that, I think the long run trend is not positive for insurability in a lot of these communities.
Let's turn to a question that is sort of along the same theme, but it's about development. This one's from Ann Draper, and it asks whether is the key issue that we're facing that real estate development continues to occur in high risk areas, or is our real problem the legacy of many decades of development that occurred without sufficient attention to fires? Rebecca, I know that's a topic that you've been thinking about.
Development is always a really tricky conversation, especially in California, where there's obviously a lot of demand for development and for housing. And so I think, I don't necessarily want to, I think that when we're talking about development, we have to think about a lot of local issues and about things like property taxes and about how much new housing is actually needed after these wildfires come through. I think that what we'd all probably really like to see is some high density housing and urban cores, because then you can tick off, some climate goals, reduce your transportation needs. But a lot of that's ultimately going to come down to what local governments permit. And when you have a place like Sonoma, where 5,000 homes burned down after the Tubbs fire, and then they needed 8,000 afterwards because they were already in a housing crunch, there's a really high demand on allowing development to happen. Whether or not you're going to allow fire-resistant construction codes to be mandated for that is a different question.
Yeah, I think this whole the whole question of how much better new construction is than old construction is also plays into it in an important way. And every time I encounter someone coming from the real estate side, they really tend to emphasize how the building codes have allowed us to make communities, even in areas of high fire risk, safer places to live. And I don't know, from the firefighter perspective, Kelly, is that something you encountered that you could that smart modern building really made a big difference, or is it basically just where the houses are?
It's really not my area of expertise, but I'm glad that real estate and development has come up as a topic, because I really don't think that, like federal agencies like myself, working for both the Forest Service and the Park Service in my career, it's not anything that we really engaged with in terms of local officials, in terms of planning and zoning. And there's really good models out there. I think the newer constructions and the road distances and turnarounds and construction material and what's allowed, on the property in terms of non-flammable type of, or not as flammable vegetation is super, super important. So when we go into communities, even though, almost every place in California is vulnerable to wildfire, right? In one form or another. It might be the grass, woodland foothills, and then it merges into a shrub component and then eventually into a timber. So given that, there's a lot of things that we need to think about ahead of time when we are planning for real estate and our needs for development. There's certainly areas that can and should be developed, but with that in mind, we know a lot more now about large wildfires and how a large wildfire spread and how we can go into some of these communities and protect these communities better. But you're right. The older communities that really didn't have in mind large wildfires, they weren't built to withstand what we're seeing, today. So we really have to think about, are the wildfires even going to be worse than what they are right now 50 years from now? And how should building codes and planning and zoning be different with that anticipation of even more impact from climate change on wildfires? I don't have an answer for that, but I do think that engaging with insurance companies and local development is super important. It's just something I haven't been involved in, but when we get into a community that is and has prepared for an eventual wildfire, it makes it a lot safer for wildfires or for firefighters to be in there to fight that wildfire.
Yeah, I do want to swing back to this topic of how to make communities wildfire safe. But there's some really interesting questions here also about prescribed burns and the extent to which prescribed burns are either facilitated or delayed as a consequence of air quality issues. A question from Emilio Villanova asking about whether the primary limit on prescribed burns is air quality issues. Rebecca, I know that's something you've looked at.
Yeah, so air quality concerns do definitely remain a barrier to using prescribed burns. They often end up being related with things like community concerns about prescribed burns. One of the really interesting things about a lot of research is that there's quite a bit of evidence that people support prescribed burns. They understand the risks of prescribed burns. They understand that a little bit of smoke now means not as much smoke later on. And in cases where people maybe don't understand that, education really does make a pretty big difference. People can be invited out to go attend a prescribed burn and see just how little smoke there is compared to a wildfire. But there's instead a lot of other barriers associated with perceived risks, particularly on the part of burn managers themselves, who might feel like they're being, that their careers might be hurt if they have a prescribed burn and it possibly gets out of control. There are concerns about limited resources, like making sure that there's actually enough trained personnel around to conduct the burn. And there's concerns about different regulations that are also limiting our ability to conduct prescribed burns, in the sense that you need to get approval from different areas. And sometimes even just getting that approval can be such a headache, from a bureaucratic headache and a paperwork headache, that people end up not even starting the process to apply for a prescribed burn permit.
And Mary, I know some of your work indicates that the health impacts of prescribed burns are less serious than the health impacts of wildfire smoke. Do you think that the Air Resources Board needs to take a careful look at whether or not it's got the right smoke exposure standards in prescribed burns, or how should we fit the new information about the health impacts into the air quality criteria that we're using?
Yes, well, so my understanding is that when there's an increase in particulate matter from a prescribed burn, that's not included, as exceeding a criteria. I don't know.
Wildfire.
On a wildfire.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. Yeah.
I do think, there isn't much literature showing the health impacts of prescribed burns, but I know from our own study, it seems to imply that just because it's the community is experiencing less particulate matter, naturally, they're getting less changes in their immune system. So I think, there also is some misunderstanding with whether or not a prescribed burn emits more particulate matter than a wildfire. And I think that if you look at the health impacts, it just makes sense that we should be taking into account that the fact that the prescribed burns long term are better for our health.
Also related to fuel reduction, there are several questions that are related to other approaches to fuel reduction, including questions about biomass utilization. Micah Elias has a question about whether we really are doing everything we can to effectively utilize biomass that's harvested as part of a fuel reduction strategy, whether that's for utilization as wood fiber or utilization as an energy source. Michael, do you have a sense of the magnitude of the opportunity for fuel treatments for biomass utilization as opposed to fuel treatments that are purely to reduce fire risk?
Well, I think the challenge with biomass for power, for electric power, has been the cost of the power relative to the ever falling costs of renewable generation. Biomass fired power costs have been increasing over time, and that's partly due to the fact that the fuel available around the existing biomass power plants is not terribly abundant, and the further you have to transport the biomass to get to the power generation, the more expensive it gets. And so there's kind of a basic economic challenge that's part of the kind of clean energy success of California that's making biomass power more challenging. I think and I just say it's the utilities are increasingly reluctant to sign long-term contracts with the biomass power plants because of that rising cost. I think there are certainly, I'm not an expert on some of the issues around gathering the biomass, but I also know that it can be quite controversial to allow for the kind of harvesting that at least the biomass power producers want to do that's in proximity to the power plants.
Kelly, you spoke earlier about the limited opportunity for doing mechanical fuel reduction when you were talking about the importance of managed wildfire. Are there prospects for improving the way we do mechanical harvesting, or for improving markets that let us do more of those techniques in areas where the risk of a wildfire is just too high?
When Michael was talking, I was sitting here thinking about definitely biomass generation for electric is one piece of it, but there's also and again, this is something that I think is worth trying to see if we could gain some traction on. Is there a place where you could haul unmerchantable timber trees to an area where you can have it can be processed, and it could be ground down to a point where it could then be shipped by truck to a processing plant that makes OSB fiberboard for home construction. So you're sequestering carbon rather than burning it for power. So that's an intriguing potential that I haven't heard a lot about. I know there's all sorts of issues with, long-term investments. Do we really put the long-term investment on the folks that are trying to create this, or do we look for government subsidy that there's some sort of, so that there's no loss, if you will, to the business piece of this? But it's worth exploring as to, the magnitude of, brush, not just trees, but we really have to look at these areas that are at high risk to wildfires. That brush needs to be disposed of as well, in terms of protecting homes and life and property. So what do we do with the brush? We normally burn it, but is there a place that it can be hauled, chipped, and also integrated into some sort of sequestered material?
Yeah,
it's a fascinating perspective that I think it deserves, especially moving forward for, say, the next 25 to 50 years.
One of the things that always strikes me is that we're always asking each alternative technique to sort of pay its own way in terms of whether it's fiber for construction materials or biomass for energy, and that if some way we could figure out a way to allocate credit, that some of which went to fire risk reduction, some of which went to increased carbon storage, some of which went to the electricity, that it seems like there should be options for making things more affordable than that we don't have access to now, and it's a complicated public policy question.
It's probably worth, the research is out there, and there's been some studies, and I think there's probably some success stories with biomass utilization as well. It's an area I haven't spent a lot of time in, but I think getting that information out to local elected officials. I just know, for example, in Mariposa, that at one point people were like, well, not in my backyard. So, it really takes a village, if you will, to really help people understand what's in it for them and get people to buy into and this collaborative effort for the long term.
There are a whole bunch of questions and good suggestions in the Q&A about what to do with all the biomass. One question, this one's from David Hsu, was asking about whether there is a real opportunity with building codes, and whether simply improving the building codes and making sure that more structures adhere to the modern codes is an option. My impression from recent fires is that there has been a big impact with higher survivability of homes with modern building codes, but that in Paradise, for example, almost all the homes predated the modern codes, and we don't have any way of requiring older homes to update their fire code compliance, as far as I know. Michael, has there been any progress in thinking about whether there is a pathway to improve existing structures?
Yeah, so Chris, your impression is exactly right. The homes that postdate the 7A building code, which is the WUI fire resistant code, have demonstrated much greater survivability in both the Camp Fire and the Napa Sonoma firestorms. And so, but that code only applies to homes built after 2009 in these high risk areas. And that's another piece of this, right? We need to be, so we need to address existing homes in those areas, because the reality is that the radiant heat released when a home burns is often the thing that will ignite the home next door. And so if your neighbor's home has cedar shingle siding on it, it's going to go up. And it's not going to matter that you have a hardened structure or a 5-foot non-combustible zone around your home. So there was a bill that was passed and signed into law, AB 36, by Assemblymember Wood, that would create a pathway for the state to go in and help existing homes make cost-effective home hardening investments. And the idea there was to use the FEMA resources that are now available to kind of start a pilot program to really learn how to do this. No one has ever done existing home hardening as a public policy before at any kind of scale. And unfortunately, the funding for that was zeroed out as a part of the budget deficit this year. So we were going to spend, $25 or so million of state money layered on top of about $100 million of federal money to kind of get this program started and do some learning to figure out how to do it cost effectively. But that is not happening this year. Hopefully it will happen next year. I think it's an incredibly important part of a strategic approach to this problem, because survivability for homes is like herd immunity, right? It's a vaccination problem. If not enough members of the community have hardened their structures, it's going to matter a lot less for the people that have.
Let me follow up with a question on kind of the same theme. This one's from Daniel Porter, and asks what we know about the cost-benefit analysis of taking all the steps we're describing, from home hardening to large-scale fuel reduction, and how those compare with the expected costs of not doing anything, of just suffering with the wildfires that occur. Rebecca, do you know of cost-benefit analysis that indicates the payback on each of the kinds of investments that are possible?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the specific one would be for vents or roofs or something like that. But generally speaking, it's a $1 of investment to $4 to $6 of benefit, of saved money.
For home hardening.
For home hardening, and for generally investing in adaptation and resilience efforts. Some of them are going to be pretty low cost, fairly high reward, like changing your vents to be 1/8 of an inch is going to probably help prevent embers from shooting into your house. But also changing your roof, which is a much higher investment, is going to make a significant difference. But if you don't have the financial means to redo your entire house, maybe at least you could do your vents, and you could make sure that your gutters and your eaves are cleaned out on a regular basis. But generally speaking, these retrofits can be exorbitant, but the payoff is pretty extreme, particularly when you compare it to the billions of dollars that we've seen lost when homes are destroyed.
And Michael, your audio dropped out, I think, just when you were addressing this point, but there are some conversations underway about liberating other kinds of financial pools in order to help pay for some of these adaptations through FEMA or other agencies.
That is the long-term goal of the state. I think it's, we're obviously in a very challenging fiscal environment for the state of California right now because of the recession and the virus. But ideally, over time, a program will be built that uses both state and federal funds to go after the existing housing stock that needs to be hardened. And I would just second what Rebecca said. It's cost-effective investments, generally speaking. But I'd also say that, and actually Mary Prunicki is a sort of a partner in crime on this. We don't know a lot. We don't know enough about the costs, the full cost, societal costs of wildfire yet in California to really answer the cost-benefit question, and also to properly allocate investments across the portfolio that we can, right? So there's investments in the power sector to reduce ignitions. There's home hardening and community hardening. There's investments in fire suppression, right? Like the fire aviation investments that the state has been making over the last several years. And we don't know quite yet how to balance that portfolio appropriately. And that's a really important question for us to be working on and ultimately to answer.
There are a couple of questions here about whether there are technology options for either earlier identification of wildfire ignitions or for automatic deployments to do suppression. Kelly, do you think that there's a lot that can be done in the tech area to improve firefighter responses?
That comes up quite a bit as well, in terms of, like, if we just were able to detect ignitions earlier, we could immediately take aggressive suppression action. The bigger question here is, where are those areas that are most at risk? And so just because you have an ignition start at 8,000 feet, maybe close to other areas that have been treated, is that really worthy of aggressive initial attack or initial response by firefighters and aviation assets? So I think the bigger question here is not just being able to use technology for, it'd be great, I'd love to see that also, in the park. It'd be nice to know where these ignitions are occurring after a lightning storm as well. But not every start needs an aggressive response. But in these areas where, if you look at and use GIS or artificial intelligence to start modeling where these highest risk areas are, then we can overlay that with ignition sources to say, absolutely, this is a extreme risk. It's the middle of August. We've got winds coming, untreated fuels. Absolutely. I think now we can be smarter about resource allocation and using technology and tools to help both our communities and our response personnel. That's an exciting area of development, I think.
Are there other areas, other kinds of technologies that you would love to see and you think it'd make a big difference?
We always kind of struggle with when a fire starts, whose jurisdiction is it on? And it's oftentimes very difficult to get real-time information on fire spread, and using possibly modeling and artificial intelligence to say, okay, we've got this fire now that started, think about the Rim fire right outside of, Yosemite, and using modeling and real-time information as the fire perimeter progresses, we can anticipate that this particular fire is going to hit this particular community in X amount of time. We're not there yet. And it's very, very difficult when we're responding with firefighters and aerial assets to really know where the fire is and where it's going and who should be involved in the decision making. Oftentimes in California, it's a very, very complicated, complex patchwork of responsible and jurisdictional authorities, including power companies and Department of Transportation. It's huge. And so, getting a handle on real time, here's the fire perimeter and here's where it's going. We can use some infrared technology to kind of see through the smoke, but I really think, in terms of anticipating where the next big fire is going to be, it really takes, some deep knowledge of the existing field condition, the the community and previous fire footprints. It gives us a really big insight into where the next big fire is going to be.
And Mary, from the smoke exposure perspective, are there technologies that you're optimistic about, or areas where a new technology would make a big difference?
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of a lot right now. That
not being where the smoke is the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, the motto, there's no safe distance from a wildfire. You know, I'm not aware of technologies that are in the forefront to try to prevent, you know, exposure, especially when you're talking about, you know, maybe not having power. It's a huge problem, I think.
You know, the federal agencies are doing a really good job with air resource advisors on large incidents. And then they're doing the modeling, the green, orange, you know, yellow in terms of the affected communities around these large fires. And so people can, you know, prepare. And the backbone of that is really the modeling that Lee Tarnay has done in California. So that kind of technology is there. And I guess from a smoke exposure standpoint of view, that kind of robustness and that baseline for our communities and the public at large, you know, to be able to go to one site and say, oh, is my community listed here? Okay, I'm not going to be affected by the local fire, but it might have some regional haze or something. But certainly, I've seen that happen just within the last 5 years, and it's phenomenal. It really provides a really great educational preparedness information for our communities, and I really want to see that expanded. So I think that'll really help, you know, agencies like CARB and local air pollution control districts, that the officials can send people to those sites on these fires, from these fires.
This has been a fantastic discussion, and we're getting close to the end. I think there'd be time for just a couple more questions, and I want to give each of you a chance to summarize some thoughts. But one theme comes up in a question here from Susan Longville that I want to ask, and it concerns alternative routes to financing, things like forest resiliency bonds. And Nicole, what are the prospects for those, and what needs to happen for them to be more effective?
Well, I think, you know, there's some early experiments that where we've attempted, you know, as you pointed out, Chris, and I think a number of the other panelists have said, you know, there are a large number of beneficiaries when we manage this problem better. And some of them are currently, you know, participants in financing the improved management, and some kind of free ride. And maybe that means we don't get the right amount of intervention, you know, and you know, a key beneficiary that is water districts, where, you know, there are big water quality impacts after fires in watersheds. And you know, there have been some early kind of I'd sort of characterize them as prototype attempts to engage water districts in fuel management and fuel reduction projects. That's an interesting area of opportunity. I also think, you know, there have been some attempts, actually notably in Marin County, to get local government to invest in greater, you know, kind of fuel reduction projects. There was an initiative that passed in Marin, but in general, you know, we don't have enough connectivity between the beneficiaries of, you know, reducing risk from wildfire and the kind of financing. I think the challenge is going to be helping people to understand how they benefit. And Californians are much more aware of fire risk than they were even a few years ago. And so I think we've made some progress there, but there's definitely a lot of work to be done.
Rebecca, that response kind of leads into a topic I know you've been thinking about, which is sort of how do communities get mobilized and incentivized to take steps to really be serious about fire risk. And what are you seeing as the bright spots, and what needs to happen to have even brighter spots?
Yeah, I've been partnering up in Marin County with a couple of communities that are pursuing FireWise recognition. FireWise is a national program run by the National Fire Protection Association that essentially allows communities to self-organize and work on fire preparedness better, whether that's evacuation or defensible space or home hardening or education in an area. And I started working with these communities in March 2018. And all three of the communities that I've partnered with have achieved FireWise status, but all three of them became extremely inspired about responding to and preparing for wildfires as a result of the smoke impacts that they felt from the Sonoma Complex fires, which is just their northern neighbor. And so having that indirect impact of the Tubbs fire, the Atlas fire, the Nuns fire, and having friends come and stay with them, having siblings who might live in the area who were personally affected became a real starting point for a lot of these communities to get cracking on their fire preparedness. And now they are community, bullhorns for getting people to pay attention and to get engaged with fire preparedness.
And this issue of how you think about community level responses versus individual level responses has a bunch of different dimensions because of the pandemic. And Mary, I wonder if you can offer some thoughts about how to think about this balance, and in particular whether the fact that we're in the pandemic means that the whole portfolio of fire preparation response tactics we use should be shift toward more individually oriented, more family, more within your bubble of contacts for coronavirus, and if, are there other things we should be thinking about that build on what we've learned about where we are with coronavirus?
Yes, I think that, it's important to keep trying to educate people on an individual and family level that they really can make an overall difference by following the COVID guidelines of social distancing and wearing a mask, because the more that we can reduce the spread of COVID, when the wildfire season does come, it's going to make it better for all of us. And especially for those firefighters that are, putting themselves, at risk for us. I think that more education on the fact that taking personal responsibility really can make an impact. And that, we know that the particulate matter in general makes you more susceptible to viral illnesses, viral pathogens, and COVID is no different. And realizing that we can play a role as a society, as a community, to try to reduce the impact of COVID and, the impact of long-term, also smoke exposure is really important.
And Kelly, to kind of close this out, you've emphasized that we're in a multi-decade challenge where, as a result of climate change and fuel accumulation, it's going to take us a long time to work through the issues. But we also have some really critical challenges we face this year. And I wonder if you can close with a few thoughts on sort of what are the need to haves in 2020 in order to keep the risk from being at totally unacceptable levels.
I think the need to have, it's a big question. The support for firefighters, I guess I just really want to go back to that. We've been asking a lot of our firefighters for a very, very long time. And this really upped the game in terms of pay equality with our federal firefighters. There's a lot of people, a lot of really very, very talented people that are leaving the agencies right now for other jobs. It just feels like we've hit a tipping point that I think really from a workforce resiliency perspective, I think that's a need to have. And I think that's really, really important that we show and demonstrate that our firefighters are our number one priority.
I think that's the right place to close this conversation. Thanks, everybody, for a set of really deeply insightful comments. Thanks to the audience for a set of really useful questions and sophisticated questions that probe all aspects of a really, really challenging era. And let me just close with best wishes for good outcomes for all of us in California and the West, and everywhere where firefight is an issue, and everywhere where we're coping as well as we can with unprecedented global pandemic. Thanks, everyone, and I look forward to the next Woods conversation on the environment. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Chris.
Thank you.